Okay, Van Cross is here. Taylor is here. Kayla's here. Reed, Hemmings, Bowers, Asbury, Tudor's here in WVSU gear. Felder, Hudson, Burdett, Newton, Massey, Richardson, Cedric, Rice is here in WVSU gear. Yeah, it's been that kind of week for me. David, Hodges, Eric, and Midkiff here in WVSU gear. Morning. Hodges is here. We've got about 3 minutes, so I guess I'll just remind you guys about the exam. We'll be online on Friday as usual. We have 50 minutes to take it. I won't physically be here, but I will be online. You don't need to be online for the exam, but you can be. Again, that way if you have problems, you can just show me. Or if you have questions about the questions, like, hey, what exactly is this asking? Then you'll be able to reach me easily to do so. What else to tell you about the exam? Make sure you do the study guides. One of my priorities today after class is going to be posting those videos of me talking about the study guides, basically the exam reviews. So I would highly recommend watching those. What else? I guess that's it. And again, like I said last time, make sure you be ready to document stuff, right? So if something goes wrong, like your power goes out, your internet goes out, or whatever it may be, let's need as much proof as you can provide, like screenshots or literal pictures of your screen, whatever it takes. And again, if I'm online, it'll be a lot easier. You can just meet me online. Of course, I guess you can't do that if your internet's down, but you know what I mean. So any questions about the exam? All right. Let's see here. Reed, Hemmings, Burdett, and Richardson, right? My other priority today is going to be looking at labs. That way, if you've already done it, hopefully you don't need to come in this week. But for those of you who have done it, whether on your own or with me, I'm sure you could agree, it can be a little confusing, right? All the details. It's a hard lab with all the little tiny details. So that's one of those reasons I recommend actually coming into lab this week. You don't have to if you get it done in time, but I think it helps because then you can see the big picture instead of getting lost in all those little details. And other than that, like I announced, I guess it was on Facebook, not on the Google Classroom, but I've been dealing with a lot of stuff at home, good stuff and bad stuff. So I just apologize for being a little bit less present as I usually am. But I'm getting caught up. And once I am, I'll let you guys know. All right, less than a minute. Any questions about exams or labs? That's pretty much it, right? The rest of the stuff's just usual. Write some papers for independent work. Actually, if I were you, I would be doing study guides for independent work right now. Hold off onto the papers until after the exam. Help you prepare. Good morning. So Bowers is here. Morning. So to remind everybody online, this is a good time. Also remind me something else. Remember, you'll have to watch the videos and answer the questions if you're online. So if you're online right now, technically this doesn't count for attendance. because you need to watch the videos when I post them. Which reminds me, I still have 2 videos to post. I'm still back behind on 2 videos, so there's that. But I guess if you are online, I do want to give you some sort of incentive. So I guess I'll go back to doing attendance words, except in this case, it'll be for extra credit. So for those of you guys online, you can send me those words and you'll get the extra credit, but only once you answer the questions that go along with the video. All right, anyway. Let's see, Reed, Hemmings, Asbury, Felder, online, Hudson, Newton, Massey is here, Cedric is online, and Eric is here, and we have Justin. All right, well, it's 8:01. I think everybody's accounted for. Let's jump back into chapter 13, which is again about evolution, the evolution of populations. It's a good time to remind you really quickly. Individuals do not evolve, right? Only populations evolve. So going back to last week's lab, before I get back into this again, just to remind you, there was no single moth that decided, it's polluted out here. I need to change my colors to dark so I can survive, right? That did not happen. First of all, no creature is making a decision like that. Evolutionary, well, I'll get back to that. I'll come to that later. But anyway, no single moth changed from light color to dark color, right? There was a light colored moth that had some mutations, and their offspring were dark, and that's where the population first started with the dark ones. Anyway. We talked about fossils. Next thing we're going to talk about is homologies. Does anybody know? Well, I guess do the first attendance word. I guess we'll do trees. Will be the first attendance word. So again, if you're online, you can send me those words for extra credit, and you'll get your extra credit once you do the questions. And if you're in person, as always, you can send me those words for extra credit if you want. Anyway, evidence from homologies. Oh, let me go back to go the right direction here. You need to know what a homology is, and it is a similarity resulting from common ancestry. So again, last thing we talked about was fossils. So fossils, we could see how things have changed over time, right? Because we could see really, really old fossils and see what they look like and compare them to younger and younger or newer and newer fossils and compare and contrast the differences and similarities. Here, we're looking at living things and looking at how they have some common features as ancestors. Because things change, right? You have these ancestral organisms, things that we all came from, and as they moved from different environments, to new environments, things changed, environmental conditions changed. Therefore, over time, the populations changed too. So again, using the black moths as an example, and this is not how it worked in the lab, but imagine if for some reason almost all the white moths were wiped out because of the pollution, right? So the predators were eating all the white moths. So let's say they almost went extinct. But then some of those moths started migrating away from those areas and towards areas with cleaner woods, for example, right? So then as the time changes for that population, they're going to start becoming light again, because then it's a disadvantage to being dark. So the predators are going to eat the dark ones, right? And if you had that happen enough, then eventually, way down the line, you might have some homologies with the original ancestors. And that's what we'll talk about right now. Let's talk about some homologies. Any questions about this slide? I think the most important bullet point on this slide, as far as the exam is concerned, is just that top one. Just knowing how your book defines a homology. And then I'm going to give you some examples. So here we go. Darwin cited similarities among vertebrate forelimbs as evidence of common ancestry. There's a lot of them, but we're going to focus on that. What do I mean by forelimbs? Depends on the kind of creature you're talking about. So for us, that's what we call our arms, right? Forelegs, flippers, wings of different mammals, right? So bats. They all have variations on anatomical structure of ancestral organisms that over millions of years became adapted to the function. So basically, again, this is just an example. I'm not going to specifically ask you about forelimbs. Well, I might. There's a question on the study guide. But anyway, because we have a common ancestor, we have these common parts. And that picture's not from your book. I'll show you another picture from your book here in a second, but I see people taking notes. And again, as far as the exam is concerned, this isn't a very important slide. This is just an example. Just an example of what homology is. These common things, right? So here's our human arm. We have things in common with this lizard forearm, and this cat arm, and this whale flipper, and this bat wing, right? We have common parts because we have a common ancestor. Here's the picture from your book, right? So your wrist bones and your forearm bone, the cat's wrist bone and forearm bone, the whale wrist bone and forearm bone, and then of course the bat wrist bone and forearm bone. Of course, they're not exactly the same because again, they have different functions, right? So therefore there's different forms. But because of the fact that there are common ancestors, that's why they are similar anyway. So specifically what we've been talking about, again, we've been talking about homologies, but now I'm giving you a different term. It's a subcategory of homologies, and it's called homologous structures. So again, homologies are when we're talking about things that are in common, right? Where we have a common ancestor, right? Therefore, we have things in common with other organisms that share the same common ancestor. And obviously, we have things in common with the common ancestor. Specifically, in this case, again, the homology we've been discussing have been homologous structures, right? Those arms are structures. Features that have different functions, but are structurally similar because of common ancestry, right? So an alligator is just trying to waddle and swim. You know, a human arm does a lot of different things. A bat is supposed to help you fly. Penguins, with their wings, they don't fly with their wings, right? They swim. So again, similarities, but also differences. Similarities due to that common ancestor, and differences due to the different functions of what they're supposed to do. And again, this is just an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions about penguin arms, or excuse me, penguin wings or alligator arms. It's just an example, and that's not from your book. So been a lot of information basically just for you to know what a homology is, and specifically this type of homology, which is a homologous structure. Which should indicate I'm obviously going to give you at least one other homology, right? Otherwise, we could just call it homologies. So yes, homologous structures are one type of homologies, and I'm going to teach you about another one. So that might be a test question. I might give you some example about, you know, horse arms or horse legs versus sheep legs. And you know, be like, oh yeah, well they have a common ancestor, and we talk about legs, and it's a structure, so we must be talking about homologous structures. So that's how it would go. I would give you some example of a homologous structure, and you would need to recognize it as a homologous structure. So any questions about this slide? All right. This is a lot of information, but before you go writing anything down, I'll go ahead and basically tell you what you need to know from it for the exam, which is that in addition to homologous structures, there's also basically homologies at the molecular level, right? So basically DNA. So again, in the exam, I might give you an example. I might describe this scenario. And if I'm talking about DNA and common ancestors and things in common, then you should say, oh yeah, that's a homology. But let me read this really quickly. It's from your book. Advances in molecular biology provide much deeper understanding of homology. So it's not just structures. Again, talking about DNA. The evolutionary history of each species is documented in the DNA inherited from its ancestral species. For example, and this is not from your book, it's not up here, and I'm not going to ask you, but I think it's a really good example. Humans cannot make your own vitamin. We can't make our own vitamin C, right? So you guys know you're supposed to eat vitamin C to be healthy, right? Because we can't make our own vitamin C. However, we have the gene to make our own vitamin C. But the gene is broken. There's a mutation. So the gene's there, it just doesn't work. Meanwhile, primates can also not make their own vitamin C. We're the only mammals who cannot make our own vitamin C because there's a common ancestor there. And that common ancestor had a mutation that broke their vitamin C gene, and it's been passed down to every species that came after that that ancestral species. And there's a lot of examples. You can look them up. I find it really fascinating. I mean, the idea that we have genes in our genome that don't work, right? Like, so why are they there if they don't work? It's because there's no deletion mechanism, basically. Anyway, if two species have homologous genes with sequences that match closely, the sequences must have been inherited for a relatively recent common ancestor. Basically, all you need to know from this, and you don't even need to know this much anyway, is what I'm saying here is, like, a scientist, a biologist will look at the sequences, right? Look at those A's and T's and C's and G's. They'll look at the genomes of two different species, and the more differences there are, the farther apart they are as far as being related, right? And the more similar they are, the more common they are, right? The closer their common ancestor. And that's something you could look up for independent work. Just think of two random creatures that you're interested in and say, how closely related are they? Or how much DNA do they have in common, you could ask. Like, how much DNA do we have in common with a chimpanzee, or an orangutan, or a dog, or a banana? I think the banana is like 30-something%. You'd be surprised. That's all we're saying here, right? So again, we're talking about homologies. We're talking about the similarities in the genomes, right? So the more differences there are in the genome, obviously, again, the farther away they are as far as being related is concerned. And these are all examples. That's a lot of information, but that's all you need to know for the exam. If I talk about this situation, you need to know I'm just talking about a homology. So any questions about this? Okay. Molecular biology provides strong evidence that all life forms are related. And these are just some examples. Again, I wouldn't say necessarily that you need to write any of this down and memorize it. I'm just giving you some examples that show that we all are related, basically. We all use the same genetic language, right? So the DNA, RNA, like we learned in the previous chapter, it's all universal. The genetic code is essentially universal. Those two bullet points kind of go together. And this is just yet another example of how the genetic code is universal. But bacteria that have been engineered with human genes produce human proteins, right? So if you know anybody who takes insulin, that's where they get it. At least these days. They used to get it from pigs. But now they've taken the gene out of the human genome and inserted it into a bacteria. But because the code is universal, the bacteria doesn't know any better. It just produces those proteins. And then we get insulin. And of course, for independent work, you can look up other stuff like that, some other bioengineered stuff. So again, as your book is saying, organisms as dissimilar as humans and bacteria share homologous genes inherited from a very distant common ancestor. So there's another good question for you for independent work. What genes do we share with bacteria? Which ones do we have that are the same? Anyway, any questions about this slide? I guess the next word for attendance, again, for extra credit, is insulin. So if you're in person, feel free to email me those words at the end of the day for extra credit. And if you're online, send me those words for extra credit, and you'll get your extra credit once you do the questions. All right. There's no questions about this slide. Let's move forward. We're making good time, which is good because it's a really long chapter. Geneticists have uncovered hidden molecular homologies. And again, to me, this is really fascinating. I have a whole book on it. And this is one of the examples I was giving you with the vitamin C thing, right? So organisms may retain genes that have lost function through mutations, even though homologous genes in related species are fully functional. So again, humans have the gene to create vitamin C. It just doesn't work for us. It's broken. So is it for the other primates, unlike every other mammal. Many of these inactive genes have been identified in humans. Oh yeah, it is right there. Vitamin C from glucose. So yeah, I forget, this is the relatively new book. It does include that. Anyway, that's just an example. Again, I'm probably not going to ask you specific questions about vitamin C on the exam, but are there any questions about this slide? Nothing important on this slide as far as the exam is concerned. This is just more examples. The book's just giving you more examples about molecular homologies as opposed to homologous structures like arms or wings or whatever. All right. There's another one, and you need to know what these are. Again, probably not that I'm going to ask you the definition, but if I give you an example of this, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's a vestigial structure, which again falls under this umbrella of homologies. We're still talking about homologies, right? Still talking about homologies, but this specific type of homology is called a vestigial structure. And it's the remnants of features that served important functions in an organism's ancestors. So, for example, whales, right? They have some of them, the small pelvises and hind bone legs, even though they've evolved away from that, right? They're not walking around. Whales don't walk, they swim. And those are almost completely gone, but they're still there. There's blind species of cave fishes that still have what's basically used to be eyes, right? There's so many different examples. Goosebumps. You all know what goosebumps are. Does anybody know? Well, first of all, what causes you to get goosebumps? Physically, not like emotionally or anything. Like, what physical thing would need to happen in the environment to give you chill bumps or goosebumps? I gave it away. Yeah, if you're cold, right? Sometimes you get goosebumps or chill bumps, whatever. How does that work? What does that have to do with being cold? Any guesses? That makes a lot of sense. And then that would still work. But this is basically, it's a useless thing. It used to work, but now it's useless. What happened was when we were hairier, of course, I know some pretty hairy people. That might still work for them. But when we were hairier, we get goosebumps and the hair would stand up and it would form like a little pocket of air. So you'd have an extra layer of insulation. It helps keep mammals warm. It does not work for us anymore because we're not as hairy as we used to be, most of us. Yet we still have goosebumps. And again, to me, this is really fascinating. You look it up for independent work if you want. Look up examples of vestigial structures. There's so many of them. Snakes still have remnants of their legs. I mean, obviously, when you look at a snake, they don't have like little legs, but if you look at the skeleton, you can tell where their legs used to be. Snakes also have, functionally, they only have one lung, but practically they have two of them. One of them that works and the other one that's, basically a vestigial structure. It's a useless thing just sitting there. Doesn't work, it's just there. And again, one last time before I move forward, I'm not going to ask you any specific questions like define a vestigial structure or give me an example of a vestigial structure. In the exam, I'll probably give you an example of some random vestigial structure, and you should recognize it as that. If it's some piece that used to be useful and it's no longer there or no longer useful anymore, then you know it's vestigial structure. Excuse me. So any questions about this? All right. Anyway. Homology can also explain observations about embryonic development that are otherwise puzzling. So your book gives this example. At some point in development, all vertebrate embryos have tails and throat pouches. Of course, those tails in most cases disappear, not for, or at least for humans, excuse me. In some cases, the tails disappear, right? Not most. But then with these throat pouches, depending on what species you are, they become different things. So if you're a fish, they become gills. For humans, that becomes part of your ears and your throat. This is just an example. Again, I probably won't ask you any questions about embryonic stuff. But if I do, again, you just need to recognize it. If I'm talking about similarities, then I'm talking about homologies, right? In this case, the similarities I'm talking about are embryonic. So, right, there's a chicken embryo on the left. There's a human embryo on the right. Look very similar, right? Anyway, any questions about that? All right, let's talk about evolutionary trees. So this third bullet point, it kind of like takes in all this evidence we've talked about from fossils and homologies and DNA sequences. And we can take all that and form what's called an evolutionary tree. And I'll go through this part quickly because there probably won't be any questions about this on the exam either, but especially this part. Darwin was the first person to visualize the history of life as a tree with patterns of descendants branching off from a common trunk. So sort of like a family tree, except with species instead of grandma and grandpa. With the first organisms to the tips of millions of twigs representing species living today. So again, basically, not that you need to know this for the exam. Your book's just saying, you know what a family tree is. Well, Darwin visualized all of life as a family tree. And even today, biologists illustrate patterns of descent with evolutionary trees, although the trees are usually turned sideways so they can be read from left to right. So again, this is just giving you information. It's good to know, I guess, but nothing on here is going to be on the exam. The final exam, mind you, this is a good time to remind you, The exam that you're taking on Friday is on chapters 8, 9, and 10. This is chapter 13. This will not be on this exam. This is going to be on the final exam. Anyway, here's an example, and you definitely don't need to memorize this. The worst case scenario, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say worst case, but there's a slight possibility I might give you this picture or something a lot like it and ask you questions. So you just need to be able to decipher something like this. There's nothing to memorize. But for example, all right, so ostriches and hawks, right? They have a more recent common ancestor. So they are more closely related, obviously, than they are to crocodiles. But ostriches are more related to crocodiles than they are lizards and snakes, and way more than they are mammals or amphibians or lungfish. That's basically what that means, right? So just like a family tree, imagine this turned sideways, and imagine this is like, all right, here's a brother and sister, here's one of the parents, right? They have more common or more recent ancestors. That's all that means. But in this book, I might ask something, or excuse me, with this picture, I might say, all right, which group of animals has tetrapod limbs? And you can look here and say, okay, so this is where the tetrapod limbs started. So everything from here down, right? So amphibians, mammals, lizards and snakes, crocodiles, ostriches, hawks, and other birds. So that's it. And I probably won't do that, but if I do, I'll give you this picture or something like it and ask you to decipher it. So it should be pretty simple. Does anybody have any questions about how you might decipher anything else on here? Okay. And some of these don't even make sense to you, probably. Who knows what an amnion is? Right? In your book, I don't think it explains it. It's not even important for the grand scheme of this class. So basically, it's a different type of egg. Anyway, I'm not going to ask you any questions about stuff I haven't taught you. I like that your book says this. Evolutionary trees are hypotheses reflecting our current understanding of patterns of evolutionary descent. Just a fancy, long-winded way of saying, hey, these trees, they're just hypotheses, right? Of course, now the one I showed you, let me back up. This one, because it's so broad and it's not very specific, like think about all the thousands of different types of birds. And it is basically broken down into ostriches or hawks and other birds, right? So it's very broad. So this one's still technically a hypothesis, but that one's, I don't know, it's kind of closer to a theory than a hypothesis. But if you were to get really specific, again, mammals, all in just one line, right? So if you were to look at all the different types of mammals, maybe like, for example, all the different types of mice that live in North America, then if you were to look at their family trees, that's more closely hypothesis. Some of these hypotheses are based on convincing combinations of fossil, anatomical, and molecular data. Again, like I just said, this is what we just got finished talking about, right? All the evidence of evolution that helps write these trees. And others is more speculative because sufficient data is not yet available, right? So maybe we haven't found enough fossils to have a good hypothesis, or maybe we haven't sequenced enough genomes to make a good hypothesis. And this happens. I know at least 2 people in this building that do this. Dr. Runke does this with tapeworms. He's actually discovered quite a few new species of tapeworms that live in sharks. And then there's a guy who runs the lab here. His name's Doug Bright. And basically, his thesis work for his master's was, and I don't know if I'm saying this exactly correctly, but I think scientists were saying, all right, there's this species of blackberry. And then this guy said, no, I don't think so. I think these are 2 distinct species. And his whole thesis was proving that, yes, that what everybody used to think was one species is actually 2. Anyway, again, all that stuff, all the evolutionary history evidence leads us to making these trees, and that's it. Not very important as far as the exam is concerned. So are there any questions about this slide? All right. So will evolution be revisited? Here's the thing, though. The well evolution thing was that was the process of science, so we skipped it. So because of that, I'm also going to go through this part pretty quickly because I'm not going to ask you specifically any questions about these whales. But I love that your book put this in here because it goes back to what I was saying earlier. That all these things, when we say, okay, this thing is more related to this thing than that thing, these are all hypotheses. And as we get new information, our hypotheses change. And that's all your book is saying here. And again, I'm not going to go into the details, but previously, scientists thought the whales were related to this thing, and then they did some more work and got some better technology, and they realized that they were actually more related to something else. That's it. I'm going to go through it quickly. we're running short on time, and I'm not going to ask you anything about that on the exam. You can read it, should read it, but I won't ask you anything. So that's it for the third main bullet point. We're now to the fourth main bullet point, the fourth of 6. So such a very long section. Natural selection is the mechanism for evolution. So this should be fairly easy. If you did last week's lab, then this is almost going to be a review for you. This is what you learned in last week's lab. But before we talk about natural selection, your book talks about artificial selection first. I probably won't ask you questions about this, but I guess it does make sense. If you're going to understand natural selection, you should at least have a broad understanding of artificial selection. And that is the selective breeding of domesticated plants and animals to promote the occurrence of desirable traits in the offsprings. That's what artificial selection is. So basically, and I think you saw this in that video with Hank, Darwin figured if humans can make these big changes in a relatively short amount of time, then surely nature can make even bigger changes when we're talking about millions or billions of years. Right, so this is just an example. I don't think this was from your book, right? Two different horses. Humans made one of them really big and one of them really small because we bred that into them. French bulldogs, for some weird reason, the #1 breed right now, right? They have all kinds of breathing issues because we bred, well, we weren't after breathing issues, but we bred them to look a certain way. Now they have these side effects. Anyway, that's artificial selection, right? That's when it's humans making the decisions. Humans saying, all right, let's have a taller dog or a shorter horse or a drought-resistant wheat strain, right? We breed these things. So you need to know what artificial selection is. Again, not because I'm necessarily going to ask you any questions about artificial selection, but it's a good segue into natural selection, which we're going to talk about a lot. So again, if you're taking notes on this slide, really you just need to know artificial selection is when humans are deciding what character. Artificial selection has 2 essential components, as you already learned in that video from Hank, because this is also true of natural selection. The #1 component is there has to be variation among individuals. So again, using the moths as an offspring, at least with the color of the moths, at first there wasn't variation, right? They were all pretty much the same, light colored. And then there was that mutation. So then we had a few dark moths, and then we had variation. And because again, like I said, it was mutated, it's heritable, right? So it wasn't this is very important too. None of the moths got covered in pollution and became dark that way, right? It's not because they were covered in soot. It's because there was a mutation. You could wash them and they would still be dark, the dark ones, right? So it was heritable, right? Heritable. It was in their genes to become dark. That's also a very important component that a lot of people seem to miss, at least not necessarily with your section, but my Bio 108 section. None of the moths were dirty. That's not why they were dark, right? They were dark because there was a mutation in their genes. It was heritable. That variation was heritable. Though, again, I shouldn't say none. I assume probably there were some light-colored moths that did get dirty and probably did have a survival advantage. But that survival advantage really was because they were dirty. Therefore, they couldn't pass that down to their ancestors. Their offspring, right?